With the October 31st deadline approaching, the EU has granted another Brexit extension until January the 31st, 2020, but has kept flexibility for an earlier departure if the MPs in Britain approve the Brexit deal sooner. As the UK's third Prime Minister since the referendum, Boris Johnson has taken a strong position on hard Brexit, keeping the option of a no-deal exit open. However, members of Parliament have rejected Boris' attempt to fast-track Brexit after his plan was approved by the EU. Now the Prime Minister is calling for a December general election to solve the deadlock. Would an early election drive Brexit forward? And will Parliament continue to prevent the Prime Minister from getting things all his way? To discuss these issues and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Dr. Yu Jie, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, and Mark Pinner, China Practice Managing Director of Intero Consulting. That's our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue. Mark, first of all, do you think the extension will have an impact upon both the UK and the EU?
Yes, well, I'm sure it will have an impact on both of them. I mean, I think this is positive, though. I think it stops the UK, or most probably stops the UK crashing out with a no-deal, hard Brexit. This is good. It gives the UK time to try and work things through, and time perhaps for a general election. And indeed, I think that is one of the reasons why the EU has agreed on this, is that it gives the UK time to try and make up its mind.
So, Jie, your take?
Obviously, it's a big blow for Boris Johnson, because his promise is 31st of October, do or die, and now it seems that it's unlikely he's going to achieve what he wanted when he promised once become Prime Minister. But on the other hand, I really question how much really Number 10 Downing Street has been really well prepared for this no-deal Brexit, because it seems to be there's no any contingency planning in place at all. So I think the extension is actually good for the UK and good for the UK economy, but not necessarily good for Boris Johnson for his own personal capacity.
Next issue is Boris Johnson was forced by Parliament to request an extension. Why doesn't he want an extension? And now the request is legally approved. Will he nominate another one to represent the UK when the new EU Commission takes office on November the 1st?
I think he probably won't. You know, I think the indications from the UK government are that they're leaving and that they won't nominate anyone. So I think it's personally, I think it's unlikely.
I mean, it's not very helpful if you're only going to have an EU commissioner last about 3 months or so. And what kind of job can actually that person properly carry? So I think for a matter of principle, of course, European Union does need a commissioner, but it doesn't necessarily have to be a British commissioner.
Yes, and I think Britain has said that. So I think they will say, look, there's little point in having a British commissioner now. It really doesn't make sense. But I think the British government won't block the EU from appointing another commissioner in Britain's place. So I think they'll be helpful. But on a point, I completely agree.
And usually in terms of EU commission appointments, usually the British politicians will occupy probably their most important position. So it seems to be so far, all the most important positions within the European Commission has been given to the other countries. So I don't think the British government would like to humiliate itself by nominating somebody in such short term.
Yeah, his very first policy speech, the new Prime Minister Boris Johnson said, with or without a deal, the Brexit would occur by the end of October, and that's a matter of few days. Given the flexibility of the extension, how likely will the no-deal Brexit occur?
I think, okay, so this is, Boris Johnson said he would rather be dead in a ditch than have an extension from after 31st of October, and clearly we're getting an extension. So, and also, remember, he promised. I think there will be an extension. I think it's unlikely that there will be a no deal. I think there is now. He's already had a vote in Parliament that says that Parliament has voted for his deal. Right? What it voted against was his rushed timetable to push it through. And the timetable was so short that to be able to get it through by the 31st of October, they would have had virtually no time to scrutinise the detailed legislation. So sure, there are many, perhaps certainly some, but probably many MPs that are looking to have a second referendum, or certainly they're trying to, as in probably the Brexiteers' word, frustrate Brexit. But there are also very many MPs who want to have good legislation that doesn't do things that they aren't expecting. So some MPs are concerned that you would have the possibility of a no-deal Brexit coming when perhaps there are disputes over legislation or timing later. They don't want that. They also don't want to have they don't want that, for example, in a rush then before a general election. So I think that they are now, so some MPs voted against his rush timetable so that they could make sure that the legislation does what they think it is expected to do. And if that means that Boris Johnson has to go back on what is just a political promise, I don't think they mind. And so that's why I think he won the vote for his deal, but he lost the vote for his political promise of the 31st of October.
That's exactly the point that I believe helped President Trump win much of the support of the electorate when he did whatever he could to honor his campaign pledges. So this time around, we have to take a second look at the political credibility and political life of Boris Johnson. If he failed to honor his promise to have a Brexit without deal by the end of October, what do you think of the prospects?
Well, obviously, I mean, he broke the logjam because let's be frank. Theresa May tried 3 times and failed miserably, and Boris tried twice. It seems to work out all right, and I was even surprised myself to actually see his deal got approved. So I think both Conservative Party and Labour Party have its own calculation, because at the moment the Tory Party is not really within majority in the Parliament. If they would like to have Boris Johnson's deal get passed and get stamped on it, they certainly do need a majority. So I think parliamentary majority is one of the key things triggered Boris Johnson would like to call for a general election. Anything else?
Yes, and to add, one thing I think that's important to note is here, that we've had the referendum over 3 years ago, and the public is getting very frustrated that there is no resolution, one way or the other. The advocates of Brexit want to see us leave the EU one way or another, and the advocates of Remain don't want to see it. But people are it's taken over the entire political agenda for about 3 years.
Absolutely.
So one thing that's very clear is that the polls want the politicians to do something. They're getting frustrated with politicians and Parliament. And so Boris Johnson, by saying, look, I'm going to try and deliver Parliament, even though he can't deliver to his political promise, he's still doing well in the polls as a result. So if you look at the opinion polls, the Conservative Party in the last few recent polls has shot up in the polls because he's trying to deliver this. And the Labour Party is doing very badly. So, Boris Johnson and the Conservative Party now want an election, not only because they want to break this hung Parliament and actually have to get Parliament to make a decision, but also because they think they'll do well.
How much damage, Jed, do you think the issue of a Brexit has done to British politics? Because we see the bleeding scars on the side of Labour and Conservatives are seriously divided. We see the divided country of the United Kingdom. I mean, it's so bad. The observers, the Chinese and European, American alike, have all been left quite stunned. They don't know what's going on in the Parliament, in number 10, in the UK itself. Well,
even for researchers like ourselves, we're all getting very confused as well. I mean, firstly, exactly what are we voting for? And secondly, is the public really well aware what does the European Union mean to them? So obviously by the time when we had a Brexit campaign, it seems to be the public was not really well informed. And then you have a large number of publics felt somehow they have been cheated by the politicians. So this somehow divide the nation. I cannot think about any political phenomenon apart from Brexit being so divisive and really cut UK into different parts. I mean, it's not just division between different social classes, it's division between different political opinions, divisions between different age groups, because there are many young people feel so angry and furious because they felt their future has been voted by the older generation. And of course, you have the regional divide between northern part of the UK and also south part of England. So it's all sort of divisions going on within the country, really without much unity, and the nation was in its knee.
Given the strong uncertainty concerning the job market, what do you think of the attitudes in general of younger generation in the UK about Brexit? Because you guys have been talking about the free movement of labour forces across the border of nation states of the EU, within the EU. And do you see any big shift in their attitudes ever since the referendum was held 3 years ago?
I think there's been a sort of a firming up of their views. So young people voted very firmly to remain in the EU. And I think Brexit, as you have pointed out, is very divisive, but it has made people, some people have changed their views, but generally people have become stronger in their views, and young people in particular. So young people are pretty, on average, like maybe just by numbers, are more and more concerned about Brexit. Right? It is becoming, because it affects their futures. Right? Many of these people who have studied abroad, they're a bit more international than their parents or their parents' parents. They really don't like it, so they see their futures being impacted. So, you know, people on one side are accused of traitors by wanting to remain as a vassal state of the EU, and the others say you're ruining our future. Right? It's very divisive.
What about politics in Brussels, Jia? Do you believe there must have been some concessions on both sides, the UK and the EU, when it comes to the flexibility and the extension itself?
Putting this way, I do not think Brussels really wholeheartedly would like to see UK leave the European Union, because by allowing UK to leave the European Union, it really shows the European integration project somehow failed very miserably. So that's the reason number one. Perhaps somehow Brussels still have a glimpse of hope. UK might stay within the EU, having second referendum. So that's reason number one. Reason number two, I mean practical reasons. We're talking about commission, and we're also talking about budget. And how are we going to plug into that hole left by billions, 21 billions, given by the UK government? Again, that's a major blow, financial blow for Brussels as well. So these are the two things I think got tangled. And then lastly, what is the future looks like for Brussels if another member state would like to leave the European Union? And perhaps Brussels will have to offer them a very strict lesson, a very strict lesson. You're not allowed to leave. Article 50 is only for contingency. It's not really for putting into practice.
On the other hand, I think this whole process has been so traumatic for the UK that I think it shows to European member states that it would be very difficult for them to leave. But a better example, a better way for them is something what I think Poland and Hungary, maybe not doing by design, but I think they've realized that rather than the UK is now trying to leave the EU but get a lot of the benefits of being a member, but instead, isn't it better to remain within the EU but squabble and complain, right, and whinge? And Hungary and Poland are doing this. The EU, the Commission, has problems with what some of those governments are doing, and this seems to me to be a better strategy. And I think this is a lesson. So I think it has been traumatic for the EU. I think it will. I think this will show that it will. In some ways, the EU strategy has succeeded in that way by keeping itself together in theory, but in practice, I think it will, perhaps in some ways, encourage countries to remain when they remain and behave badly.
Perhaps, you know, this really even bring up the entry criteria for, you know, become European EU members. You know, how qualified you are in order to become. Because I mean, part of the reason why UK signed up back to 1973 is because it considered itself as being a trade bloc rather than anything else. But nowadays, the European Union has now become a political project, and I don't think that's really part of the reason many member states really sign up for.
That is entirely true, and that is the reason why many of the Brexiteers, particularly the older ones that remember that referendum which they had on joining this trade bloc, they think, well, we didn't sign up for a political agreement. So their reasoning is that, look, this isn't what we wanted, this isn't what we were asked to in the first place. So that's part of much of their dislike of the EU.
How will the customs be like following the Brexit for the UK?
Well, from trade, from tariffs and customs, there may be a problem with Northern Ireland, if we can get onto Northern Ireland here.
The hard border of Northern Ireland, yes. So,
under Boris Johnson's deal, Northern Ireland, in practice, would remain within in practice would remain as part of the customs union with the EU. That means there would in effect be a tariff border and checks between Great Britain, so the mainland UK, and Northern Ireland. On the other hand, it would also mean that Northern Ireland would remain within the customs union of the whole of the EU. So in some ways it would add to trade, it would make trade harder between most of Britain and Northern Ireland. On the other hand, it might be an advantage to invest in Northern Ireland because you could potentially get the best of both worlds.
And do you think this is good news for IRA if there are any leftovers? So, because of the separation movement and the bloody conflicts that deprived so many families of their loved ones, and despite the dynamics of the peace process, do you think this is an issue? I
think that if Britain left the EU under a no-deal agreement, it would certainly have been a major issue, because under the Good Friday Agreement, Britain promised that there would not be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. And if Britain left the EU and the customs, well, in particular if Britain left the customs union, you would have to have some kind of border checks between Northern Ireland and the Republic. Otherwise, you would get people like just moving goods abroad. It would wreck the EU. It would get, it would be a complete mess for trade purposes. So they were very worried about this, that if there was no agreement with the EU on this, that Britain would basically force a breaking of the Good Friday Agreement. However, under this agreement that Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, has agreed with the EU, that there would not be a hard border. In fact, the hard border would be between the island of Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom. So I think he's avoided it. And in some ways, it might be that Republicans actually quite like this, because it divides the island of Ireland from the United Kingdom.
Well, that's right. And also partially, I'm just thinking about in terms of foreign affairs, in terms of UK's credibility, because you can't just tear up something you sign up like back to 10 years ago, isn't it? I mean, it doesn't, sorry, 20 years ago. It doesn't really give UK somehow of being a credible international player when it comes to negotiations. So I think that's really a dilemma for the UK foreign policy in the future. You know, if you are constantly asking for extension, if you're constantly having all these nebulous movements between Parliament and executives, and who are going to trust you? I mean, which country are you really sincerely would like to negotiate free trade agreement with you without really much clarity?
I think this is a temporary situation, though. Look, because I think we're likely to be heading to a general election, right, quite soon. By the looks of the polls,
3 years earlier.
That's true. That was a disaster. Maybe this one would be, but with a bit of luck, the UK traditionally has had government by one party. Okay, in recent years, since 2010, it has not been, right? But traditionally, particularly with Britain's first past the post system, you've had one-party governments. And if the country can go back to that, or a stable coalition, right, like they had between 2010 and 2015, there is no reason why Britain shouldn't go back to its position of being regarded as a stable, particularly almost like a model stable government in Western Europe. So I don't see why that can't go back. And I think most of in terms of signing trade deals with other countries, I don't see why other countries wouldn't accept that this is a temporary glitch, right? Yes, it depends on the results of the next referendum, the next election, next general election. But I don't see, most countries, I think, will accept that this is going to be a temporary glitch. Certainly now it is a mess, but I think in the future it should settle down.
Well, President Trump has been very supportive of Brexit. Nevertheless, he said recently that the UK would not be the first in the line for signing a trade deal. What did he mean, Jia?
Well, obviously, in the beginning, Trump saying we're going to do a historical trade deal, but obviously he flip-flopped as usual. It basically just means when it comes to trade deal, size matters. Of course, United States and EU trade deal, that's much, much more important. Or US-China trade deal, perhaps even more important for President Trump than UK-US trade deal. And also, I'm just thinking in terms of the model of the economies between two economies. I mean, American economies are far more diversified than comparatively, for example, service-oriented UK economy. So when it comes to trade deal, I think UK is in a much weaker stance when they're facing the United States or in facing a country like China.
But do you think the political capital of President Trump will be greatly promoted ahead of the election, very much like the impact of killing Baghdadi by the CIA in the recent development, because of this guy, I'm sorry for saying this, President Trump is looking for a win. He's looking for many, many victories ahead of the elections to shore up the morale of his electorate and the support from his own Republicans in the D.C. So what do you think of the political and economic uncertainties concerning Brexit for the prospects of President Trump to win the next election?
Oh, that's a big question about the US. But what I could add, if I can go back to the last question, I can add one topic to this. So I think there are many reasons that why a US-UK trade deal may be more difficult than people think. Some things, parts of the economies are very different. So for example, the NHS, right? Britain will not open up. Like the US has a private health sector. Right, the UK has a mainly state-controlled health sector, which the US says, look, if we're going to have a trade deal, you should allow us to compete against the NHS. That means you should open up your trade sector, right? Why can't we compete against it? Or how about the price of drugs? The NHS deals with prices of, has controlled prices of drugs, which are low. So part of a trade deal might say, the US would use in negotiations to say the UK, you're being defensive about your price, your medical sector. Also, there are many other areas like this where I think there could be many problems as well. For Trump, I mean, yes, I mean, politics does come into these decisions somewhere, but
business is business.
Business is business.
And I really don't think foreign affairs that matter that much when it comes to presidential election or even the general election in the UK. So ultimately, Trump will have to work out what exactly his electorate would like to hear. So, and therefore he present that narrative to convince the electorate. So, but Brexit really, in eyes of American public, is almost like a fantasy. It's like a never-ending drama than anything else. And I really don't think really having either agree with Brexit or disagree with Brexit would give President Trump any credibility or adding anything additional. Well,
given the track record of us not joining the single currency for the UK, given the pride and prejudice of Britons for centuries, do you think the issue of Brexit is more of a joke than a serious issue on your agenda for being or continuing to be a major player on the world stage?
Well, I think Brexit has undoubtedly undermined the UK's reputation to some extent, right? Britain has lost influence. First of all, many countries, like the United States and China, wanted Britain to remain in the EU so that it could influence the EU in ways that the United States and China wanted. So the UK has lost out on part of its influence in the world. And the chaos around the resolution of Brexit certainly makes the UK look weak, for sure. But it hasn't fundamentally changed Britain's role in all of the global institutions around the world, nor has it fundamentally changed Britain's own economic strength, not in terms of global rankings. So sure, it has made a bit of an impact. It's embarrassing for the UK. The UK does not look like with such a stable government and with delivering great governance that it once did in international eyes. But it's not catastrophic.
Jay, you have been an expert of EU affairs. Will Brexit reinforce significantly the position and the strength of the Franco-German axis in shaping the future of continental Europe, particularly when Russia is looming larger geopolitically, and when the issue of military spending for the NATO becomes a thorny one on the agenda across the Atlantic Ocean? So what does that mean for the future of continental Europe?
Well, certainly it does. I mean, if we're considering in the past, it's always France, Germany, and UK are the major three members somehow upholding the European Union. And nowadays, you're only left with Macron and the successor of Angela Merkel. At the end of the day, I would say, is how France and Germany be able to convince the rest of Europe that European integration project is crucial and is so important for its own population, and then somehow to have the sufficient influence to the normal people on the ground. So at the end of the day, the two countries, yes, of course they can uphold the European Union, but on the other hand, we're having EU 28, soon going to be 27, and what about the rest of the EU 27 think about the European project? That's also important as well. It's not just about France and Germany, but it's also about a large part of the European Union. So we might really end up with a two-tier Europe. So on the one hand, you have the older Europe, traditional founding members of the European Union, and we also have new European states, and who may like to project its voices and influences as well. So we have to look.
It's very much like the situation in ASEAN, the regional bloc. You have the rich five and the poor five.
Sure.
What do you think of the future leadership of the European Commission following the election? The new leadership will soon take office, right? On November the 1st, they will take office. Do you think, what kind of UK policy is the new leadership likely to take and assume?
I think they will probably largely continue the policy from before. I think we'll have to, any big changes, we'll have to see how the individuals really deliver this. My feeling that, without the UK, I mean, one trend I think we can look towards is that the EU will be, and has been, a little bit more protectionist, because the UK was the most open market in the whole of the European Union. Without that influence, there is more of a tendency to be a bit more, slightly more closed in terms of trade negotiations. London
has been known for for being a financial hub in Europe, for the financial services that China needs so badly. What would happen to, for example, the RMB clearance centers in London? Will that be something encouraging for China, which is deeply mired in the trade war with the United States? And so as I'm concerned, there will be an upcoming official visit, the first of its kind since 12 years ago, by President Xi Jinping to Japan, which is the third largest economy. Will that mean a lot to the post-Brexit EU? What do you think of the broad picture here?
Well, the broader picture would be China will have to choose which partner it would like to forge. So that's China's choice. But then on the other hand, I don't really think completely London's advantage by international financial hub will be eradicated completely by Brexit, because partially we have sufficient infrastructure, sufficient financial infrastructure to allow renminbi or allow any other currency trading platform. So I think the advantage for London is still there. But however, how Boris Johnson is going to present that story to his own electorate, sooner we have this general election, and that's his challenge. Now it's just to make sure the bankers benefit, but how the people vote for him will really gain the benefit by having the UK out of the European Union, but still keep the special status for City of London.
Can I add something to this?
Yes.
So I think I really wouldn't say, even use words like completely eradicated the City of London special status. That, people thought before Brexit that the City of London would lose like half its jobs, but that really hasn't happened. So I think the city, after Brexit, the City of London has proved pretty resilient to this. So I think Britain's status as a global financial hub will not change as a result of Brexit. Sure, you've seen a slight change in some jobs moving to places like Frankfurt, but it's not a lot. So I think this role as a global financial hub will remain important to China, right, to the US, to Japan, and to the whole world.
Most of the Chinese observers, if they do follow the process of Brexit as far away as in Europe, they would take the issue of Huawei very seriously. They would be wondering if Huawei would help the UK reinforce its position politically and economically in the European Union following Brexit. With that, we come to the conclusion of this dialogue with Mark Finner and Yi Jie on the issue of Brexit. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.